So I think one of the things that really brings people into this sphere is the idea of what Ramsey Paul coined as Pan-Nationalism. Now, I know there's probably other people who use it in a similar context, but most of the people who have heard it in these circles have heard it from Ramsey Paul. And that's basically self-determination taken to its logical extreme, that every people have a right to a homeland, or to a certain extent, every people have a right to an independent state in which they can preserve and advance their people and their culture. So on the surface, this is a really good idea, and it's something I think a lot of people cling to because of globalism, because of multiculturalism, because of mass immigration. It sounds really nice. We all just have our own countries. We all don't bother each other, etc. The issue is there are logical limits to this, and I think a lot of people kind of have a stage one thinking perspective of this. Stage one thinking is where, well, basically it's you look at this, the first stage. You say, okay, here's my ideology, or here's my idea, here's the immediate effect of it, and if that effect is good, we're going to go with it. It kind of, to a certain extent, ignores what happens after that. So, okay, so you have stage one. What about stage two? What about stage three? What are the long-term consequences? And I think there's a tendency to overlook that. And I think the reason why there's a tendency to overlook that is because a lot of people in these circles aren't really political scientists or historians. They're kind of ideologues or populizers. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying they aren't necessarily the kind of people you should be looking to for more than a general guideline, for an actual kind of practical way to bring things about. So my point in this video is to kind of discuss this idea of pan-nationalism. Is it really practical? Is it really desirable even? And I think it's something that a lot of people, like I said, they look at it and they go, this is a great idea, I want my country back. But like I said, is this really plausible? If we're going to give people the right to limitless self-determination, is there anywhere where it stops? Do we stop at the traditional nation-state? Do we stop at regions of the nation-state? Do we stop at the town level, the county level, at the individual person level? Where does it end that people have the right to self-determination? Also, what about places with mixed populations? Are they just all supposed to partition and send some of the people to one side and some of the people to the other side? These are all kind of questions I think fail to get really recognized or discussed, so I'm going to discuss them now. So I think the biggest question you have to ask yourself whenever you look at an independence movement is simply, would an independent state in that case be viable? And in the vast majority of cases, it's not viable. It depends how you define an independent state. If it has the basic resources to sustain itself, it can create a sufficient military to ward off foreign threats, if it's big enough to make treaties on an international stage, how independent or how dependent it will be on a great power. Because make no mistake, all smaller countries are always in the sphere of a great power, to use Victoria II's terms. It may not always be obvious what sphere they're in, but if you have a smallish country, it's going to be more or less a satellite state of a bigger country. And that's happened all throughout history, and that will continue to happen until the end of time. And in a lot of cases, smaller countries have the choice of what great power they want to be subject to. Do you want to be subject to Russia, Britain, America, or a more localized power? And I think a lot of people have, like I said, this stage one thinking. Like, let's look at Catalonia, for instance. Catalonia wants to leave Spain. Spain is a tyrannical government. They want to be free from Castile. They want to be an independent country. So what would happen if they became an independent country? They would immediately be within the EU's sphere of influence. Now, Spain is obviously within the EU's sphere of influence, but Spain's a relatively large European country. It's able to put a united front towards the EU. It has a lot of negotiating power and a lot of negotiating standing. It can make treaties on the national stage. It has a viable economy. Perhaps one of the things that people tend to overlook is, would the independent state have defensible borders? Traditionally, at least, that was one of the biggest determiners of sovereignty, whether or not a country had logical and defensible borders. To a large extent, that's why Poland kept getting overrun, and the Ukraine as well, because they have completely indefensible, unmaintainable borders. Russia doesn't either, but Russia has the benefit of just being so big that it doesn't really matter that its borders aren't defensible. And I think to a certain extent, its expansion has been driven by a desire to have stable borders. But if we look at like Spain, for instance, Spain has, generally speaking, very defensible borders. Portugal isn't a military threat, and France, which is the other great power, they have the Pyrenees Mountains blocking it off. Great Britain has logical and defensible borders. To a large extent, the Scandinavian states do. I know it has a long border, but most of it is uncrossable. It is something that Greece has a logical border. That is very important when you think about how viable a state is. So you have population, you have economic strength, you have prestige, you have military strength, all these things that determine whether or not an independent country is viable and how much actual freedom and how much actual autonomy it will have. So like I said, Catalonia, I don't think thinks about it in multi-stages. The question is, do they have more autonomy, and are they better able to preserve their culture and their identity within the Spanish Union, or would they as an independent state? And I think if you're honest about it, much as with Scotland, if they became independent states, they would immediately be completely subject to the EU. They'd have similar power to like Belgium, which doesn't have any power, and they'd be put through the Euro blender. They would just be completely subject to a great power, and a foreign great power, because Castilian, you can say what you will, but it is a Spanish culture. It's, to use paradox terms, it's in the Spanish cultural group. So the people of Catalonia, for whatever reason, decided that it's better to be subject to pan-European multiculturalism than to be part of Spain and to have autonomy within Spain. And to a large extent, a lot of these secessionist movements, I think, are just hostile to the idea of trying to make it work. Like when we had the Scottish referendum, it wasn't independence, status quo, max devolution. It was just independence, yes or no. And I think Peter Hitchens wrote an article and said, Devo Max isn't on the ballot because it would win. So, like, Catalonia's approach wasn't, okay, we're going to seek autonomy in these ways. Maybe we're going to try and renegotiate equalization payments. It was immediately, we have to leave, let's go. We have to leave, we have to break up the Spanish Union. We can't try to solve this problem. Because I think a lot of countries probably could resolve their problems if they moved to a more federal structure or even a confederal structure. I don't know if that's viable in Italy, if you could kind of split Italy up into 3 autonomous regions, north, south, and center. But I think in almost all cases that's preferable to just countries breaking apart. Like, let's look at some countries that I'd say are completely what's the term I was using? Unviable. Armenia is a completely unviable country. It's in the middle of at least 3 hostile powers. On one side you have Russia, 3 great powers. You have Russia, Turkey, and Iran. Regardless of what Armenia does, regardless of how much money it puts in, Armenia is never going to have the military and economic strength to be fully independent. It's always going to be within the sphere of one of those 3 powers. It's always going to be a satellite state. And what the current Armenian government decided was, choosing between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, there's no choice at all. It's better to be a subject of Russia, more or less, because Russia is an orthodox, somewhat more culturally similar power, as opposed to being in the sphere of Turkey, who committed genocide against them, and Iran, which is kind of completely alien. So Armenia has opted to join the Eurasian Union because it's better, I would say, to have a voice within the Eurasian Union than to try and fail at being a completely independent country. And if we look at Yugoslavia, that's one of the best examples of this. The Balkans has become full of tiny countries that are completely unviable. They don't have defensible borders. They aren't economically self-sufficient. They don't even really make sense from an identitarian perspective. So we have things like Bosnia and Herzegovina, where like half the country's Albanian, half the country's Serbian, and it doesn't make any sense as an independent country. Croatia has a massive undefended, indefensible border. Hungary does to a large extent. Romania is a mess, especially since Moldova left. So the question is, like, would it be better if Yugoslavia had continued to exist, but maybe just decentralized more? I think one of the issues was, from my understanding, Slobodan was trying to Serbianize the country and centralize decision-making power. And I think Yugoslavia was, to a certain extent, probably the most logical solution if you have a bunch of really small states that have some cultural similarity to each other. That being said, I think people give too much criticism to the Austro-Hungarian Empire because it did function pretty well. It had, I think, its problems weren't so much cultural or national per se. The issue was it needed to be centralized more in some ways. The military was a mess. There was all kinds of weird trade restrictions between the different countries. The railroads used different gauges. It really did need some more centralized military and economic planning. But other aspects of it, I think, were pretty good, to be honest. The various parts of it enjoyed a lot of autonomy. The government, in many cases, actively promoted the local cultures, particularly in Poland towards the end of Austro-Hungary. They promoted Polish literature. Polish was the official language along with German. My understanding was there was not a great deal of immigration between the various component states of it, but it because they were all kind of tied together, Austro-Hungary was able to field enough prestige, economic might, and military to remain a viable and independent country. And ultimately, I think due to bad leadership and an inability to modernize. But that's kind of, to a certain extent, a separate issue. It's interesting because I've heard the founder of Czech nationalism, upon hearing that people wanted the Czech Republic, Bohemia, to be independent, said they're crazy. If we became independent, we'd just be a subject of Russia instead of Austria or of Germany. And as a satellite state of either of those countries, we'd have a lot less autonomy, and we'd have to have a lot more of a hostile power controlling us. Like, some of these nationalist movements are obviously complete nonsense. Like South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Nova Russia, they aren't going to be independent states. It's a lie to say they're just going to become part of Russia, which makes more sense than independent states, but it's to pretend that these countries are going to last more than a decade if they actually got independence is wrong. The only thing that might happen is Russia, the diplomatic consequences might be so bad of them being annexed, they just won't be formally annexed, and they'll just join the Eurasian Union and be de facto parts of Russia. Like, if we were to break up France, for instance, France has defensible borders. It's mountains there. Alsace-Lorraine is rough territory, and its really only crossable border is blocked off by Belgium. So, I hope I'm kind of making sense here. It's a bit difficult to explain this. But that's kind of another problem the Ukraine has. The Ukraine is this massive country with borders that are all completely porous. And it's always struggled, much like Poland, to retain some form of independence, just because it's just in the middle of everything, and it's kind of doomed to be in the sphere of influence of one great power or another. And you can say, oh, it's imperialism, it's bad, but that's just kind of the reality of things. In terms of realpolitik on the international stage, it's to a certain extent a zero-sum game. Either a country is going to be in the orbit of one great power or another, and in some cases the only decision you can make is which one you're going to be in the orbit of. Like with South Korea is a fairly large and powerful country, but if you look at it, it's surrounded by like three or four greater superpowers. We have China, which is basically a superpower, Russia, which is basically a superpower, Japan, that's a great power, and you also have a very strong American influence. So I think South Korea kind of realized it had to be in the orbit of one of them, and it decided that America was the best to be in the orbit of because America's the furthest away and it's the most benevolent, and it asks very little of it other than for it to just defend its own borders and to be a loyal ally. Whereas China or Japan would probably make it into a satellite state. I mean, Japan had actually colonized it at one point, and God knows what Russia would do if it went into its orbit. So that's, I think, something for people in like South Korea who want to cut all ties to the U.S. have to keep in mind. Okay, if we kick out the U.S., then who's going to be the new influencer? Because there's always going to be one. If a country can't become a great power or a superpower, it's going to be in the orbit of one of the great powers. And that was kind of a thing during the Cold War. Most of the post-colonial states are completely unviable. They don't have an identity. They weren't industrialized. They had a weak military. They were dependent upon kind of a neo-colonizer to run their country or to manage its foreign affairs or to indirectly manage its economy. With the exception of South Africa, the sub-Saharan African countries are pretty much all too weak to really stand on their own 2 feet. So they have to seek a benefactor of one type or another. If not America, then the Soviet Union. If not the Soviet Union, then China. Now, am I saying that all separatist movements are bad? That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying if you're going to go into, okay, this part of the country should secede, this part of the country should secede, you have to think about it. You have to say, do I enjoy more freedom and autonomy as part of a larger state? You have to think about the economies of scale, the economic benefits, the integrational benefits. Like if Quebec was to become an independent country, it would be completely unviable. It would be surrounded on all sides by Canada. It would, if it introduced its own currency, you would have to convert it back and forth between Canadian dollars. That would be a disaster. Canada couldn't do economic planning anymore. It couldn't do continent-wide infrastructure planning. Quebec would probably almost immediately become a client state of the U.S. because it doesn't have the population, the economic might, or global prestige to really be an independent country. And I think what Quebec hopefully ultimately realized was it's better to be basically an autonomous part of Canada. I mean, Quebec is able to make French the sole language of Quebec. They're able to pass all these laws to preserve their culture, to limit migration. I think they have laws that limit that, to provide a lot of subsidies to French cultural stuff, to milk money out of the federal government. To a large extent, Quebec benefits more from Canada than Canada benefits from Quebec. And I think people who want Quebec independence just don't really think about that. It's the same thing for a lot of countries. If they became independent, like Catalonia or Murcia or any of these guys, they'd probably almost immediately fall apart. That's not to say, like, what are kind of some other countries that I think might be viable? Sicily, I think, could be viable as an independent country. It's very culturally, economically different from the rest of Italy. It also has viable, defensible borders, and it's kind of far away from the other great powers. So it'd probably still be within the EU's orbit, but I think it's naturally distinct enough. The fact that it was a viable country for a very long time, even though it was in the orbit of Spain or France or whoever, I think says something in its favor. Whereas, like I said, Belarus is not a viable country. It's just immediately got reabsorbed by Russia. It's too culturally similar, too small, and too important a strategic position for Russia to really let it go. If the Sami were to get independence, that would also be a disaster because they have this desolate Arctic wasteland in the middle of nowhere. How are they supposed to defend that? Can you imagine a Sami state going to like the WTO and trying to have global trade negotiations? That would be a disaster. I don't really know what else to say about it. Hopefully I explained myself. Hopefully you kind of get where I'm coming from. it's good to preserve your identity and your culture, but you have to ask yourself, what is the best way to go about that? Is leaving a cultural union the best way to go about that? Is trying to break free of kind of your overlord state the best way to go about that? Obviously, things like reducing mass immigration and preserving your culture and physical removal are good things towards that end. But with the actual political status of nations, I think it's something you really have to put a lot more thought into and move beyond just plain old stage one thinking. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope I made some sense and I made some good points. I'll talk to you guys later.